you can compete in the online leaderboards and battle with armies of the more than 1 million troops. 1 million troops.
1 million troops? The presentation that made Takufuji fans of us all. But did you ever really stop and think about what it would mean? You know, a game that throws around 1 million troops in a single scene. Unfortunately, the game he was promoting, 99 Nights 2, failed to live up to those lofty expectations, with far fewer characters visible on screen at any point. In fact, we've never really seen a game throw around that many characters. But it did remind me of a different time, when developers were chasing huge armies and bustling crowds, and it just so happens that one of the most interesting examples of this shipped on the PlayStation 2 almost 18 years ago. What you're looking at here is 65,535 individual on-screen enemies, all running at 60 frames per second on a PlayStation 2. It may be difficult to parse, but this is what ridiculous ambition looks like in motion. So you might be asking yourself, what the heck is this game and why am I even talking about it? Well, this is Ikusagami for PlayStation 2, and you'd be forgiven for not having heard of it before. At its core, it's basically a game in the spirit of the Dynasty Warriors series, but with an enemy count pushed to the absolute limit of reason, and maybe even slightly beyond. It's a game I've always found fascinating, and it encouraged me to look at the history of what one might call the large-scale battle games. Thanks to modern emulation, we can even peek behind the curtain to better understand how a game like this was even achieved on the hardware. But first, we need to rewind to the beginning of the PlayStation 2 generation, the turn of the century. There was a time when technology was changing so rapidly that developers often found themselves experimenting with these outlandish ideas just because they could. From modeling fluid dynamics, to the beauty of fireworks, to rendering atmospheric effects like rain, and beyond. This was the first console generation where simulating complex interactions and behaviors suddenly became possible. And one of the more popular concepts that came flooding out of that era is this idea of flooding the screen with as many active entities as possible. Case in point, the PlayStation 2 launched in Japan with Koei's Kessen, if you remember. This game features huge armies charging across an open field in battle. It's a strategy game at its heart, but it hints at something greater in scale than had previously been thought possible in the console space. Later that year, Nintendo showed Super Mario 128 at their Space World presentation, a riff on the Super Mario 64 title. Mario 128 was designed to show up to 128 Marios on screen running around in full 3D. This never became an actual game, but the idea of so many individually moving objects certainly made an impression at the time. Sony kinda ran with a similar idea with Pipo Saru 2001, an Ape Escape spin-off game involving crowds of monkeys and pants theft. As you progress, you'll be fighting large crowds of monkeys while collecting their trousers. A strange concept for sure, but another example of crowd simulation in this early era. Then there's games like State of Emergency. You remember that one, right? It's not a great game, mind you, and it definitely did not live up to the hype, but it demonstrates this large crowd simulation in action as you run amok across a range of environments. But finding a proper gameplay purpose for these large crowds was not so simple. But I would argue that one series which got it right from the start is Dynasty Warriors, or Shin Sangoku Musou. As a North American launch title, Dynasty Warriors 2 represents the beginnings of the open battlefield action genre. The idea of freely exploring a vast battleground while slaying dozens of enemies was appealing, and the strategy elements add some additional depth. However, as you can see, the draw distance is extremely limited, and the number of on-screen enemies, while impressive for the era, is still relatively small. Now, the series was popular enough that even companies such as Capcom tried their best to capitalize on its popularity. And then, suddenly, just as the generation was coming to a close, Genki, the creator of the Tokyo Extreme Racer series, published a little game known as Ikusagami. Boasting the largest number of on-screen enemies in any game up to that point, Ikusagami could support over 65,000 characters on screen at one point, all while maintaining 60 frames per second. The game was first demonstrated at TGS 2005, and I was there for that one. They had a special demo version, a disc that I happen to have right here. This demo is unique in that it was specifically designed to showcase the raw number of on-screen characters possible in the game. The default mode is a 3-minute run where the player is tasked with defeating as many of the 65,535 enemies as possible within the time limit. It takes place in a single empty battlefield with no detail, but it demonstrates what's possible in this engine. The main game, of course, is a bit more restrained on that front, focusing on actual stage design with proper progression. There's still thousands of enemies on screen at any given point, but it's usually not quite as absurd as this original TGS demo. So I was curious. The sheer amount of stuff on screen is hard to parse, but there's clearly something interesting going on under the hood, right? How the heck did they pull this off? Well, first of all, let's talk about the visuals. Thanks to PCSX2, we can not only increase the rendering resolution, revealing details that are otherwise invisible at the original resolution, but we can also extract data from the game itself. I pulled these textures from the game, and as you can see, we basically have a sprite sheet of the very enemies you face in combat. Meanwhile, this is a texture sheet used for the 3D models across the battlefield. At a higher resolution, you can clearly see the delineation between the polygon enemies and the sprites. It's basically a LOD system, and it's obvious that this was gonna be necessary, but at its native resolution on a CRT, the trick is really effective and it becomes difficult to distinguish between the 3D models and these sprites. But how does the crowd system work? Well, my best guess is that these groups work more like an instanced particle cloud. The PS2's vector unit can handle geometry in a way that's not entirely unlike a modern mesh shader, weirdly enough, where everything is broken down into these small meshlet equivalents. In such a case, the developer could then upload the enemy mesh and all the sprite data to the vector unit, and then render it over and over again with little to no additional overhead. Basically, they could instance a small number of assets like the enemies to achieve these gigantic numbers. You could then apply animation and positioning rules to the body as a whole to make it behave like a giant particle cloud. In fact, if you look at the mini-map here in the upper right hand corner, which is just a texture that's updated every frame by the way, you can see that the horde is moving like a giant cloud swarming towards the player. It's pretty neat. Now in the main game, of course, there's both friendly and enemy units on the map, and they often engage one another. And while engaged, you'll note that the developers also spawn particles around each battle cluster to give the illusion of arrows raining down from above. This is then coupled with some nice bloom effects, lending the game a rather dreamlike aesthetic. They even spent time creating a system for displaying shadows beneath the unit clusters. It's not just a bunch of polygons slapped on the field with no shading, there is a genuine attempt at simulating the effect of shadow. Even individual units running around have this acceptable blob shadow that better ties them to the environment. The draw distance itself is also pretty robust. Yes, the maps themselves are relatively small, but you can gaze out across the terrain and see enemies from just about everywhere, which enhances the sensation of facing off against a gigantic army. Another impressive achievement stems from the loading times. The time from main menu to sub-menu to in-game is miraculously short. There's basically no waiting for anything, suggesting a very tight and well-managed data structure. In a way, the whole game winds up feeling kinda like a tech demo turned into a game, which is also kinda why I wanted to showcase it in the first place. It's even more impressive when considering that it all runs at a steady 60 frames per second. Even when the screen is filled with alpha effects and thousands of objects, the game rarely slows down. Sadly, this game never received a North American release, so many PS2 owners didn't have a chance to try it. It did at least make it to Europe under the name Demon Chaos, but either way, I recommend seeking it out and giving it a shot, just to experience the sheer madness. What's interesting to me though is that this push for large crowds began to die down almost immediately after this game. That's not to say there weren't other games trying similar things at the time. Shiny Entertainment gave it a shot with The Matrix Path of Neo, which includes a playable burly man brawl sequence featuring hundreds of Agent Smiths. There's also early Xbox 360 games such as the original 99 Nights, which manages to showcase some pretty impressive battles, larger than anything in the sequel really. not to mention Heavenly Sword on the PlayStation 3 or even the first Assassin's Creed games. But this quest for large crowds ultimately fizzled out as the focus shifted to more advanced graphics techniques. That's not to say it's evaporated completely. Large crowds have remained a staple of the Total War games, for instance, while Assassin's Creed Unity remains one of the most jaw-dropping examples of both huge crowds and lighting, something none of the subsequent games have managed to match. Then you have stuff like Serious Sam 4, which attempted something at an almost unprecedented scale. One of its most impressive features, really. But in general, it's not something we see all that often in modern games. I'd imagine part of this is driven by the last generation of consoles featuring capable GPUs paired with precious little CPU grunt to drive them. It's entirely possible that this influenced the design of games during this generation such that large-scale simulations just weren't worth pursuing. In this new era, however, with more capable CPUs in the consoles, perhaps we'll see a return to this line of thinking. For now though, it's great to reflect on games like Ikusagami. It may not have been a huge hit, but the ambition certainly warrants some consideration. Perhaps one day we'll finally have those 1 million troops.
Wow. 1 million troops.